On New Year's of 2001, the gentleman you're looking at experienced something that no one should ever have to go through. When I explain it to you a bit later on, you'll understand just how tough these guys are. In this video, I'm going to be discussing a series of disturbing things that happen around the world, many that have footage attached to them, and most of which I can guarantee that you've never heard of, because that's what I do. So, I'll tell you everything, but as usual, let's get into the backstories first.
I just want to play. And as the series progressed, he saw his chances of hitting 300 go down the drain on the last day. He was on.
What happens immediately following this point in this footage is very heartbreaking, and even if you aren't a fan of sports or don't know anything about baseball, once you know a little bit more about the man behind this, I think you'll understand why it's just that tragic. The case begins on the snowy morning of April 1st, 1996 in Cincinnati, Ohio. It was opening day for the Cincinnati Reds, and by the time the fans made it to the Riverfront Stadium, the sun had fortunately broken through and temperatures were climbing towards 60 degrees. This is a very important day for many people, and so when they first woke up, seeing snow wasn't exactly promising. But it eventually worked out, and more than 50,000 fans would fill the seats to watch the Reds take on the Montreal Expos. Behind the home plate stood John McSherry, a 51-year-old MLB umpire starting his 26th year in Major League Baseball. McSherry had been told by his high school baseball coach that if he wanted a future in the game, umpiring might be his path, and he actually took that advice and never looked back. Over 25 years, he'd worked more than 3,000 games, 2 World Series, 8 National League Championship Series, and 3 All-Star games. At 6'2" and well over 300 pounds, he was impossible to miss, but what most players would have remembered was his patient and respectful demeanor. His ejection rate over 25 years was extraordinarily low by MLB standards. He had just 42 in total because he treated players with respect even when they disagreed. Whether or not he was right, he was always fair and never tried to overpower anyone. The Reds manager, Ray Knight, called him supportive, solid, and caring, and Barry Larkin said that if any person could prove that baseball players and umpires don't have to be enemies, it was John McSherry, and people were even reluctant to speak to him if they had any sort of criticism because they just felt bad. He was very well loved, and that's what makes the next part of the story that much more tragic. See, in the years leading up to the event that we're about to get into, McSherry had a number of problems relating to his health. He had collapsed in a game in 1991 due to dehydration, he'd left very important games due to heat and dizziness, and had a lot of issues with shortness of breath. And around this time, so again, 1996, he had an irregular heartbeat and had been feeling particularly ill. In fact, I read that he had even postponed a doctor's appointment just to work this opening day, moving it to April 2nd instead. And knowing this in hindsight would prove very tragic. Opening day 1996 would begin, and for the first little bit, it came with all the usual excitement. However, just 7 pitches into the game, McSherry called timeout and waved for another umpire to replace him. He spoke briefly to the catcher and then turned around and started walking towards the gate behind home plate. He only made it about 10 feet before dropping to his knees and falling face first onto the warning track. Trainers and doctors rushed to help, and CPR continued for 15 minutes as the stadium fell silent and others cried and consoled each other. McSherry was eventually transported to University Hospital, but doctors were never able to restart his heart. At 3:01 p.m., approximately 50 minutes after he collapsed, John McSherry was pronounced deceased from a massive heart attack. The remaining umpires, in shock, initially decided to resume play after a delay, saying McSherry would have wanted that. But some players sobbed and refused, saying it hurt so much because John McSherry wasn't just a great umpire, he was a great guy. At 3:21 p.m., the game was officially postponed, and the crowd, never having been told over the PA system exactly what happened or just how bad it was, started booing the announcement, thinking it was a weather delay. When many of these fans learned the truth through news reports, they called into radio stations to apologize, but yeah, it doesn't look good when you see it out of context. And I also have to say I'm sure many people in the crowd figured it was related to what happened to John. That's my optimistic side speaking. This tragedy really shook a lot of people, and it opened a bigger conversation about umpire health. Between 1991 and 1995, as I said, McSherry had left 5 games early due to health issues. He had already collapsed before in 1991 from dehydration. And more than a decade before his death, he'd even admitted to feeling ill constantly, saying he spent most of his waking hours feeling dizzy. At the league's request, McSherry attended weight loss programs at Duke University during multiple off-seasons. He would lose weight but eventually regain it once the season began, and the league did pay for these programs, but they had limited enforcement power because union contracts didn't include weight restrictions. An investigation after McSherry's death also revealed that 58 of 64 active umpires exceeded American Heart Association guidelines for healthy weight, and 25 were severely overweight. The autopsy revealed that McSherry passed from a massive heart attack caused by severe coronary artery disease and an enlarged heart. On April 5th, more than 1,000 people filled the same church in the Bronx where he'd been baptized 51 years earlier. Fellow umpire Ed Montague delivered the eulogy, joking that John's size was big, but it was dwarfed by his sense of humor. He also said that his love of baseball was unsurpassed and that he was always self-conscious about whether he'd gotten a call right. Eric Gregg, another umpire and close friend, said he'd modeled himself after John and tried to call balls and strikes like he did, saying he's the ideal umpire. The league's response was initially pretty limited. MLB instructed umpires to be more physically fit and gave at-risk umpires paid leave to lose weight, though union contracts still prevented mandatory restrictions. However, a bigger transformation came in October of 1999, when the MLB hired a director of umpire medical services, establishing a program that treated umpires like a 31st team, with health education, on-call medical services, and partnerships with fitness experts. John McSherry's number 10, was retired, and the Reds dedicated their umpire's room to him with a plaque honoring his memory and commitment to excellence. And in 2023, he was inducted into the Irish American Baseball Hall of Fame. Opening day on April 1st, 1996 is one that most longtime baseball fans will probably never forget. He was an amazing guy, and you have to respect it. Rest in peace, John.
Once we rolled John over, John never became conscious. I don't think he even heard me when I was talking to him when I got to him.
Any of them have seen anything like this happen? And, you're talking about a man that devoted his life for this game.
As soon as he hit his knees and you knew something happened, I was hoping he just tripped, and it's a terrible day. He's a great guy, one of the nicest guys in baseball probably, and I see anybody that knows him, he's going to be missed.
This is a shorter one, but it is pretty interesting. It begins in a section of the Alps in northwestern Italy. Here, a body of water called Lake Miage sits at over 2,000 meters above sea level. This lake sits beside and was named after a glacier called Miage Glacier. Its surface is blanketed by this sort of thick rock debris that gives it a distinctive gray appearance, and it's very visually stunning. Where the glacier edges the lake, towering ice cliffs rise up to 30 meters above water, and for more than 2 centuries, people have observed ice breaking away from these cliffs and crashing into the water below. Small calving events happen frequently during summer afternoons, and the site was accessible to hikers, photographers, and tourists willing to make the trek from the nearest trailhead. It's a pretty moderate one. And by the way, this word is pronounced calving in America and calving in British English, so I'm just saying both. While scientists had said that ice falls could create large waves without warning, this wasn't highly spoken about or anything, and visitors continued to make their way up to the remote location, taking the risk to witness something so cool up close. The summer of 1996 brought unusual conditions to the area. August is typically peak tourist season with predictably warm, sunny days and fairly stable weather, but that year saw periods of heavy rain, and for the glacier, all this extra water started causing problems beneath its surface. Water poured into cracks in the ice, forcing them to split deeper. And at the waterline where the glacier met the lake, meltwater that was flowing carved out notches at the base of the ice cliffs. This all slowly weakened the massive sections of ice hanging above, and by early August, one particularly large section of the ice cliff had become dangerously unstable. On August 9th, 1996, tourists began making their way up the trails to Lake Miage, and on this day there were plenty of different visitors heading there. Once making it there, many positioned themselves directly along the shoreline, setting up cameras and watching the massive ice cliffs, hoping something would happen. And those who were there did report hearing strange noises, almost like small explosions, but what nobody really could have known was that the structural integrity of an extraordinarily large section of ice had been compromised, and without any warning, a massive block broke away from the cliff face and plunged into the lake below. Of course, by this point, it was too late for many of them to escape. The ice mass was somewhere between 7,000 and 16,000 cubic meters. When it hit the water, it resulted in what scientists would later describe as an anomalous wave. Basically, it far exceeded anything seen at routine calving events at this location. The wall of water struck with enough force to sweep 11 tourists in total from their positions along the shore, though thankfully no one actually passed away as a result of this. Multiple people were wounded though. This was a medical emergency and of course required helicopter evacuation and alpine rescue coordination, but as I mentioned, all 11 tourists survived their injuries, so that's good. I think this footage is so wild and I've never seen it touched on before. Given the fact that this was caught on camera, the incident later prompted pretty significant scientific analysis. Around 3 years later, researchers published a detailed examination of what had happened and why August 9th had been so different from typical calving events. In this examination, the scientists emphasized the mechanisms at work, 3 of which were water infiltration, thermal undercutting, and crevice propagation that drive these sorts of ice cliff failures. Perhaps more importantly, the researchers drew an even more significant conclusion about alpine hazard management. They addressed how policies must prioritize prevention measures over such tourist activities, even though it could create conflict with economic interests. In 2002, a foundation was established that conducts glacier monitoring and studies mountain safety across the region. And so today, safety and oversight has improved, but of course, this means less fun. I'm very glad to hear everyone made it, even though some didn't come out completely okay. I hope they all recovered. On June 20th, 1984, 2 young fishermen were casting their lines along the southern bank of the Spokane River near Spokane Falls Community College in Washington State, expecting their typical quiet afternoon of fishing. The stretch of water was a fairly popular spot for anglers, and at around 3:30 p.m., as they were out there and well settled in, something unusual caught their eye drifting in the water. What appeared at first to be river debris or a piece of wood revealed itself as something far more disturbing as it floated closer. The fishermen immediately called authorities, and the local fire department dispatched a boat crew to retrieve what they discovered. What they pulled from the water was the undressed, incomplete remains of a woman. The individual was without a head, without hands and feet, and investigators believed that it was done with a larger blade, possibly an axe. Over the following days, a doctor from the King County Medical Examiner's office performed the autopsy, uncovering harrowing details about the woman's final moments. She had endured unspeakable acts with a blunt instrument and displayed injuries and bruising that revealed that what she had went through extended well beyond just the killing itself. The examination determined that she stood approximately 5 feet 7 inches tall and weighed roughly 130 pounds. She had blonde hair and an average physique. She had notable scarring on both knees and her left bicep and 2 distinctive moles on the front of her neck. And pretty tragically, the medical examiner found evidence indicating that she had delivered a child somewhere between 1 and 2 years prior to her death, which meant a child was out there somewhere who had lost a mother. The body's state indicated that she had been submerged in the water for anywhere from several days to possibly multiple weeks, with the river's frigid 48-degree Fahrenheit temperature inhibiting decay and making precise time of death determination nearly impossible. And without a face for witnesses to recognize or hands for fingerprint analysis, investigators had no avenue to establish her identity. As time went on, the case appeared increasingly hopeless, and unusual discoveries just kept emerging. For example, weeks after the body's recovery in July of 1984, a dog returned home with what looked like human remains to a resident in Spokane's Rimrock neighborhood. Police responded immediately, wondering whether these might be a missing portion of their Jane Doe, but subsequent mitochondrial testing proved they belonged to an entirely different person. And even more bizarrely, the FBI somehow misplaced this hand while it was being sent for testing. So not only was there a single hand from an entirely different person brought home by a dog, but the FBI just lost it, and there was never an answer as prior tests didn't match anything in their databases. Something about all of this is highly unnerving to me, but anyways, going back to the woman from the river, she was given a burial in an unmarked plot at Fairmount Cemetery, becoming another nameless body among the unidentified. Detectives chased down every possible lead and investigated hundreds of tips, but each one evaporated into nothing. The investigation files filled up with unsuccessful leads, and as years accumulated, the officers who originally handled the case moved on through retirement or transfers, and it started to really feel like an impossible mystery to solve. But bear with me because this wasn't over yet. 14 years later, on April 19, 1998, at around 7 p.m., a woman and her dog, another dog, were walking through an empty lot at the intersection of 7th Avenue and Sherman Street, roughly 4 miles from where the original remains had been discovered. This lot used to be home to a church, but it was demolished in 1989, and by early 1998, it had become overgrown with wild blackberry brambles and high grass. The woman's dog started behaving oddly, tugging toward the base of an embankment, and when the lady investigated, she found what looked like a human skull partially concealed in the soil, with 2 neck vertebrae still connected. And so, once again, police secured the location and initiated an excavation, uncertain as to whether they had encountered a new crime or something tied to their existing cold cases. The timing did create some confusion, as this occurred during the active killing period of serial killer Robert Lee Yates in Spokane. Investigators couldn't initially establish whether the skull was male or female, and yeah, there were a lot of factors here. A detective who had taken over the 1984 case had an idea that would ultimately end up being a good one. In January of 2001, he arranged for the Jane Doe's body to be exhumed from Fairmount Cemetery for DNA testing, as just a year earlier in spring of 2000, a medical examiner had noticed that the angle of the cuts on the vertebrae attached to the skull aligned perfectly with the cuts that were on the torso's neck. And after she was exhumed, DNA testing further validated what both of them had suspected. The skull belonged to the Jane Doe. 17 years later, another piece of the puzzle was confirmed. And this part's pretty wholesome. Before the skull was confirmed with DNA and it was being transferred to a forensic anthropologist in Western Washington, the detective brought along his daughter, who remarked that since they had another person in the vehicle, she deserved a name. So the girl proposed the name Millie, noting that no one deserves to go without a name, and from that point forward, the unknown woman became known as Millie Doe in all official documentation and press coverage. With the skull now available, forensic artist Carrie Stewart Parks developed facial reconstructions in 2002 and again in 2007, finally providing investigators with a face to present to the public. The case received an upload to the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System as case number UP489, representing at the time the only unidentified female in Spokane County. The Spokesman Review published features on Millie's case, and more tips came in from throughout the country and even from overseas. A woman from New South Wales reached out to investigators in 2004, believing that Millie might be her missing daughter, but sadly for her, DNA testing eliminated the connection. In 2015, another hopeful lead suggested she could be Sheila Pauley, who had disappeared from California in 1980, but DNA from Sheila's sister and son ruled out that possibility as well. Over the years, investigators would compare Millie's DNA against 26 different missing women, every single time hoping for a match, but they would consistently come up empty. The working theory developed that she couldn't have been a Spokane local. Surely someone would have recognized her from the reconstructions if she had been from the area. But finally, a breakthrough would eventually arrive through technology that hadn't even existed when Millie died, and from a detective who wouldn't give up. In September of 2021, Sergeant Zach Storment submitted Millie's now severely deteriorated DNA samples to Othram, a Texas laboratory specializing in cold case resolution through genetic genealogy. The Spokane County Medical Examiner's Office had designated $350,000 in American Rescue Plan funds exclusively for testing unidentified remains, and Othram had recently demonstrated their capabilities by helping resolve Spokane's 1959 Candy Rogers murder, among many others. Despite the degradation of the DNA, they actually had used specialized forensic-grade genome sequencing engineered for this sort of compromised evidence, and amazingly, Othram scientists managed to extract sufficient genetic information, eventually constructing a comprehensive DNA profile on this Jane Doe. Their genealogy specialists invested months comparing this profile against publicly accessible databases, pinpointing distant relatives and constructing family trees in an attempt to find closer connections. This investigation uncovered divorce records listing 2 sisters, Ruth and Deborah Waymeyer, and after thorough research, an investigator named Nicole Hamada located Deborah Waymeyer. She was still living in Oklahoma. When Oklahoma City police arrived at her door requesting a DNA sample, Deborah later described to reporters that the moment felt like taking a sledgehammer to the chest. For decades, she had constantly wondered about her sister, Ruth, but never knew how to locate her or what could have happened. And on February 17, 2023, the DNA confirmation arrived. After 38 years, 7 months, and 28 days, Millie Doe was identified as 24-year-old Ruth Bell Waymeyer. Ruth was born April 16, 1960, in Spokane, the same city where she died. She attended Rogers High School just miles from where she was found, and into early adulthood, she was said to have lived a very transient lifestyle. It turns out that absolutely no one reported her missing either, and if we look at her life circumstances, we can tragically understand why. Her mother passed away before she did, she was estranged from her father, and her sister Deborah was separated from her by this family division. As for who committed these terrible crimes, we don't have any confirmation, but we can draw some loose conclusions. She had been married twice by the time of her passing, and her first husband has fully cooperated with police. I couldn't even imagine his reaction seeing the police arrive at his door regarding a marriage from 38 years ago, but it seems he had nothing to do with this. Her next husband, Trampus Vaughn, was married to her when she passed away. We don't know much about him, but he did have a criminal record, and we know he never submitted a missing person report regarding his own wife. He died in California in 2017 before he could ever answer for this silence, and unfortunately, if this was his doing, no one will have ever faced justice for the murder of Ruth Bell Waymeyer. And as of late 2025, this is all we have. I also just want to say one of the reconstructions was incredibly accurate considering what they had to work with at the time they were created. The others not so much, but that's not uncommon. And this one's terrifying. May this poor woman rest in peace. It's always extra sad hearing about stories where the person wasn't even reported missing. It is still very amazing that we were able to at least find out who this was. To me, this footage is a pretty hard watch. There's nothing particularly graphic about it or anything, but there's something about how eerily silent it is. You just know the people in this footage are experiencing some of the worst moments of their lives. It was recorded by a person who was on the scene of a devastating bar fire that happened in the Netherlands on New Year's of 2001. And when I give you context, you'll understand why I feel this way. Volendam is a traditional Dutch fishing town about 20 kilometers north of Amsterdam, famous for its colorful wooden houses and very picturesque harbor. It has some pretty unique musical heritage and purportedly has even produced more famous musicians per capita than anywhere else in the Netherlands, with a population of just under 23,000. On New Year's Eve of 2000, so going into the year 2001, hundreds of young people were getting ready to celebrate the upcoming year at one of their favorite local spots, Café de Hemel, with Hemel translating to heaven in English. The cafe was on the top floor of a 3-story building right along the village's harbor. Both floors underneath it also had bars, and it was especially popular with teenagers and young people from the area. That night, the cafe's ceiling had been decorated with dried fir branches that had been hanging there since early December, all strung up with Christmas lights to create sort of a festive canopy overhead. And by midnight, around 350 young people between 13 and 22 had packed into the 3-story building. Now, depending on the sources, I do get different numbers, but it seems like the building was only legally permitted to hold about 80 people. This, of course, created dangerous overcrowding conditions, especially if many were only on one of the floors. The alcohol was flowing, music was playing, and everyone was in high spirits, counting down to the new year in what should have been just another exciting celebration. And New Year's would hit, but shortly after midnight struck, someone inside the crowded cafe lit a bundle of sparklers. Now, exactly what happened next is often still debated, but those sparklers somehow made contact with the bone-dry Christmas decorations hanging from the ceiling, none of which were treated with fire-resistant chemicals. Within 15 seconds, fire raced across the entire ceiling as the untreated fir branches went up instantly. Between just 30 and 45 seconds after the ignition, temperatures soared and a massive fire swept through the room. It was essentially a rolling fireball that consumed the oxygen and sent burning debris raining down on everyone below. And of course, very quickly, lights melted and it caused a short circuit that plunged the cafe into complete darkness just as people were trying to find their way out. Those who were there described blind panic, and people screamed and trampled over each other, completely lost in the smoke and darkness. Young people were even jumping out of the 2nd and 3rd floor windows to escape, many getting seriously hurt from the falls. Those who couldn't reach the exits found themselves trapped because many windows had bars preventing escape and other emergency exits were completely inadequate. 4 people lost their lives immediately that night, and as ambulances rushed the injured to hospitals across the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, the true scale became even more clear. 10 additional people would pass away as a result of their injuries over the following weeks, bringing the final death toll to 14. The youngest victim was just 15 years old, and another was a worker who died trying to save customers. Of the 241 people hospitalized, 112 required intensive care, and 96 suffered serious inhalation injuries. 20 of the worst burn victims had to be transferred to Belgian burn centers because Dutch facilities were overwhelmed. Among the survivors were two men named Simon and Nick, who would later become famous as the Dutch singing duo Nick and Simon. Simon escaped without physical injuries, later saying the alcohol might have saved his life by keeping him calm, and Nick unfortunately suffered third-degree burns and lung damage, spending 23 days in the hospital. I can't even imagine how horrid this was for so many people. Investigations expectedly concluded that this was completely preventable. 7 months before the fire, the municipal council had sent Café owner Jan Veerman a 3-page letter warning about potentially life-threatening safety violations. The Christmas decorations weren't treated with fire-retardant chemicals as required by law, emergency exits were inadequate, and the venue was severely overcrowded. The one functioning emergency exit led to a rooftop with no ladder, and a large number of minors under 16 were inside without proper supervision. All of this had been documented, much of it was warned about, and it was all ignored. The aftermath devastated this close-knit community where everyone knew everyone, because remember, there was only 22,000 people living here. Soon after, about 15,000 mourners, nearly 2/3 of the population, marched through the village in a memorial ceremony attended by the Prime Minister and the, at the time, Crown Prince. And keep in mind that for the survivors, this was really just the beginning. 16% developed PTSD, and many faced lifelong disfigurement requiring years of surgery, including this man, Lau Snook, who provides a lot of interesting insight in this video. I did have to listen to a dub as this is obscure outside of the Netherlands, but I think it does very well at explaining things and I recommend it, so it'll be linked in my sources. The owner of the location, Jan Veerman, was eventually convicted but received a suspended sentence and community service. The tragedy forced the Netherlands to completely overhaul safety regulations for entertainment venues, and the 14 graves still receive fresh flowers regularly. And it was hard for me to confirm this. Unlike my Oma, I don't speak Dutch, so it's already hard having to translate, but I did see in comments that it seems the third floor of the building still sits as it was after the fire all of these years later, and that only victims of the tragedy are allowed to visit, so this is good to hear. It's a very respectful approach. There's also a fairly new exhibition in the Volendam Museum that the public can access. Rest in peace to all of those who lost their lives in this tragic disaster, and my heart is with the many, many victims of this. I cover a lot of these, and it might be a while till I do another one because the lessons are always the same. Overcrowding, poor exit access, fireworks inside, and poor fireproofing. But this case is particularly unique to me for a number of reasons, and I was very interested in covering it. So this one's absolutely unbelievable. Like when you hear the final numbers and what sparked it, you'll be mind blown. But I just want to give a heads up first that this story has a lot of conflicting information as to what actually happened on the day itself. So I've done my best to map it out and still try to clarify the gaps for you guys. There's also a language barrier and I may get some pronunciation wrong, so feel free to correct me if you're Korean. In the spring of 1982, a 27-year-old police officer named Woo Bum-kon was living in Gangyu Village in rural South Korea, pretty far from where his career as an officer had begun. See, just months earlier, he'd been stationed at a very prestigious security post in Seoul, where he guarded senior officials and I even read at one point the president. This was a recognition of his exceptional marksmanship from his time as a Marine Corps sniper. But unfortunately, excessive drinking and violent outbursts had cost him pretty much everything. He'd been demoted and transferred to this isolated countryside posting, and even though he seemed to handle this well, inside it was driving him crazy. The villagers in Gangyu eventually started to call him the Mad Tiger, and this was given to him due to his violence during interrogations. And outside of his career, things weren't as good either. He lived with his girlfriend in an arrangement that subjected them both to constant gossip in this very conservative rural community, as they were not yet married. The combination of his greatly reduced salary, his sense of humiliation from being demoted, and all these people gossiping around him created a pressure that just kept building in a guy that clearly already had a lot of issues. But this is absolutely no excuse for what we're about to get into. On the afternoon of April 26, 1982, Woo came home for lunch and fell asleep afterwards. And it was said that while he was sleeping, his girlfriend noticed a fly on his chest, so she swatted it. This woke him up and he took it as an insult, and eventually after some fighting, he completely lost it. Everything that had been building inside him had finally erupted, and He smashed furniture, threw things around, he attacked her, and when neighbors intervened, he finally left. Many sources do say that the fly thing wasn't actually true and that headlines were just using it. They claim they were just fighting and then it eventually escalated, but either way, a conflict happened and he eventually left. Now this is where things get wild. At 7:30 on that evening, so after fighting with his girlfriend, he went to the police station armory while all the other officers were at a meeting. Here, he took 2 rifles, several hundred rounds of ammunition, and 7 hand grenades. Following this, he went on a complete rampage. The attacks began at 9:30 this night. Woo's first victims were 3 young women working as phone operators at the local post office. He walked in, took them out, and cut the telephone lines, severing the village's communication with the outside world. He then threw a grenade into a marketplace and opened fire, taking out 6 more people. Among the people wounded in this marketplace attack was his own girlfriend, who came running when she heard the shots. At around 10:30, he moved on to a different village in the same county, and took an 18-year-old student named Kim hostage, forcing the boy to get him a soft drink from a nearby grocery store. He walked in with him, still holding him hostage, and after receiving the drink, killed Kim, then turned on the store owner's family, taking out the owner's wife and 2 daughters while the owner himself escaped with a leg wound. Woo moved from house to house in this village using his firearms and grenades and targeting homes where lights were still on. In total, 18 people in this village lost their lives. And no, it doesn't end here, it just gets even worse. Kim then moved to another village where a family was holding a funeral wake. He arrived in his police uniform and told them he was searching for communist infiltrators. The mourners, who at the time were trusting his authority, later invited him inside one of their homes for dinner. He sat with them, ate their food, and complained about his low salary and his transfer from the city to the countryside. But when someone remarked that his ammunition didn't look real, he opened fire. 12 people lost their lives in this house and 8 more passed away on the streets outside. And I was wondering why there's a wake happening so late, but it turns out in Korean culture, these wakes traditionally last quite a few days. People will gather at all times around the clock during this period, and it was still before midnight anyways. While Woo continued to move between 5 villages across this mountainous terrain, taking out any person he encountered, the police response unfolded unbelievably slowly. Local officers had been alerted within minutes of the first shots, but it took them an hour to assemble a search team of 37 officers. The provincial police chief was at a reception in Busan and couldn't be reached immediately, and when the search team finally did assemble, they decided not to pursue Woo because of the darkness and poor visibility, instead positioning themselves under a bridge to wait. The National Police Headquarters in Seoul wasn't even notified until 1:40 in the morning, which was more than 4 hours after the massacre began. Riot police from nearby cities didn't arrive until 4 in the morning, and the army was never called for assistance despite the rural area's difficult terrain. For 8 hours, Woo moved freely through the darkness, and terrified villagers had nowhere to turn because the phones were dead and the police were waiting. He eventually took refuge in a farmhouse belonging to a 68-year-old man, telling the family that he was there to protect them from a communist infiltrator and ordering them to gather in the main room. When police finally caught up with them at around 5:30 in the morning, Woo set off 2 hand grenades, which took out 3 of the people in this farmhouse and Woo. The final count here was devastating. 56 people had lost their lives, not including Woo himself, and the deceased and the wounded were transferred to hospitals all around this rural area. Across these 5 villages, grandparents, parents, children, neighbors, and friends were gone. The nation understandably reacted with shock and fury, not just at Woo himself, but at the police. This should have never been able to happen. The Interior Minister resigned just 2 days after the incident, and the president held him directly responsible. 4 police officers were arrested for negligence, and investigations documented all the errors: the unsecured armory, officers drinking while on duty, their refusal to mobilize because of darkness, and the 4-hour delay before notifying Seoul. None of this was acceptable. At the victims' memorial service on May 1st, protesters threw stones at police and smashed their kiosks, expressing their rage at law enforcement incompetence. And then things just got really quiet. Korean sources later revealed that authorities had actively tried to, quote, make his existence disappear, suppressing records and a lot of information about him. Even worse, for decades there was no official memorial for the victims. There was no place where the families could gather, and they didn't even get an official acknowledgement from the state. Now mind you, this did occur during a time where the government controlled information very tightly, But even still, it wasn't until April 26, 2024, which is 42 years after the shooting, that the first official memorial finally opened in the county. The monument features 2 golden hands releasing a dove into the sky, and a wall listing the names of all 56 people who lost their lives and the 34 who were injured. The old police station where Woo had taken the weapons was demolished, and it seemed like the county was just finally ready to confront what had been buried for so long. This one was just unbelievable to me. It was recommended to me in my Discord by the same person who actually recommended the Pushan explosion from the last video, and when I saw it, I couldn't believe the numbers. And globally, this was actually the worst event of its type by a lone gunman in history, only being surpassed in 2011 by the Norway attacks. Rest in peace to every single victim of this tragedy. Thank you guys so much for watching. I truly appreciate it. I've been working so hard on these videos recently. As I said, it's usually 10 to 12 hours a day at least. I take the odd day off. You don't have to worry about me or anything like that, but yeah.